Hello, I'm Alan Clements. I'm the owner and designer of Cascades Gardens. It's a garden in Bonsall, in Matlock, near Derbyshire. And when I bought the house and grounds in 1996, the house needed a new roof and the garden was just a jungle. In fact, the house had been an old corn mill and the garden a quarry. There was even an old lead mine. Well, Cascades Gardens is a 4-acre garden. It has a spectacular landscape with a 100-foot cliff, streams, waterfalls, and about an acre of woodland. Well, my background was an interest in Eastern philosophy and Buddhism, and I'd spent the summer of 1996 looking at Japanese gardens in Kyoto and Nara. These I found very fascinating, and I was really keen to have a garden like that myself. Well, I'm sure like many of you, I watch Monty Don's programs of gardening, and one of the things that stuck in my mind years ago was, he said, well, a garden's not a place, but it is a journey, and I think you'll all agree with me that, well, you start at the beginning, but you never quite finish, do you? Well, I want to tell you about my journey not only creating a garden, but taking it from jungle to paradise. Long ago, 1992, before I bought the house and grounds, sadly my first wife died pretty horribly of liver cancer. I was only 35, I was pretty fed up about that, and I thought, well, who's the one person who can help me sort out my mind, sort out my life, tell me the meaning of life? Well, I thought I'll go and see the Dalai Lama. Well, everyone laughed at me and said, well, you'll never get to see him. But, well, I did get to meet the Dalai Lama, and there I was in 1994 in his living room, able to meet him and ask my question. Your Holiness, can you tell me the meaning of life? Well, he shrugged his shoulders, he laughed a bit, and said, well, I don't know. Then he sat me down, we had a cup of tea, and for 40 minutes he told me exactly what he thought life was all about. In fact, what he said was, well, our purpose in life is to be happy, and most important, to help others to be happy. But in order to be happy, you've got to calm your mind, you've got to get peace of mind, and meditation can help you. On my way home from the trip in India, I passed by a Hindu temple in Amritsar. I went to see some monks there, and I met a priest. He chatted to me, and I said, well, can you tell me the meaning of life? He said, well, it's all about the environment. We need to protect our environment, our surroundings. He pointed to a dead plant, and he said, what we need to do is become one with nature, to look after our plants. A little while later, back at home in the UK, I went across to Newark, and there's a Zen Garden there, a Japanese garden. Well, I met the Zen priest. His name was Maitreya. We had a cup of tea, actually, and he was making scones. And we looked around the garden, and he said to us very clearly, he wrote me a poem. Just as a flower, human beings are beautiful, being nature. And that made me realize that really we're all part of nature, we're all the same thing. Inspired by this visit, I decided to take a holiday in Japan. Well, it wasn't so much a holiday as an exploration of Japanese gardens and visiting all sorts of temples, Zen Buddhist temples. I was lucky enough to go up into the Alps and to a monastery called Haiji. And they said, yes, you can come in for a few days and join in with our meditation, but you have to be and act as a Zen priest, a trainee Zen priest. Well, I said, why not? And then in my room that night, strangely, they locked me in. I thought that was a bit weird, but at 3 o'clock in the morning, knock on the door, Mr. Clements, please come and have your meditation. 3 o'clock in the morning. So we all filed down the corridors, and you can see in the top left hand there of the picture the monks all lined up, and that's typical of how we were that time. And I learnt to meditate Zen style. One of the interesting things was that there was a priest walking behind you with a big stick, and if you fell asleep, or if you wanted to loosen the muscles of your shoulders, he would oblige and hit you on the shoulders. But what I was struck by was the beautiful surroundings around the temple. It was such a peaceful, relaxing place, an ideal place to be peaceful and calm and think about life. Well, continuing my travels in Japan, I visited a lot of monasteries in Nara and Kyoto. In Kyoto in particular was perhaps the most famous of the Zen Buddhist monasteries and gardens. It was called Daito Kuji Temple, and the garden was Dysonin. It's one of the oldest buildings in the Zen Buddhist sect. Zen, of course, is famous for the practice of Zazen, or religious meditation. A fascinating subject. Well, the Dysonin Garden was quite small, actually, quite fascinating. It was composed of rocks and gravel and beautiful clipped conifers. This sort of garden, the stone and shingle gardens, are called Karen Sansui, and they're quite famous. You may have seen them on the television. And the whole idea of this particular garden was the way that the rocks represented mountains, and the gravel was flowing away from those rocks along the ground there, a little bridge, and it was all about a beautiful landscape. I was able to have a chat with the abbot. Actually, we had a cup of tea. He made a pot of green tea for me, and we sat on the meditation platform overlooking the garden, and we chatted about Zen. He said, well, the garden's all about imitating and revering nature. It's an ideal place for our monks to meditate and for our visitors, and it's all about just sitting, or Zazen. And I felt very comfortable there, and as they say, sitting and becoming part of the landscape. There was another garden in the grounds of this temple. It was rather strange. The garden was just a big area of raked shingle, raked with very careful patterns, and it just had 2 piles of stones in the middle. Nothing else. And I asked about, well, what is the meaning of this? And well, basically it's all about emptiness. The whole idea of the garden is really to remind you that to get peace of mind, to get happiness, we need to just empty our minds, and this is how we can find peace. Well, I didn't just visit those stone and raked shingle gardens. I also saw some very lush green gardens, as the one you see in the picture here. The abbot was pleased to show me round as a British visitor, and he pointed out that there's always a pond in these gardens, and perhaps an open space of grass, surrounded by beautifully clipped bushes and trees, and fading into the distance. Beautiful, lush and green. And can you see here, notice that there's no flowers. Unlike British gardens, some of the Zen gardens are really quite green, quite simple in that respect. As part of my tour, I was very lucky. I was able to go to the home of Mr. Sumitomo. He turned out to be a very eminent businessman, a friend of my uncle's. And he took us to his home and to show us his garden. The garden was spectacular and enormous. It had that pond in the middle, as I described before, and the open spaces of clipped grass, very carefully clipped, and a surrounding of trees and bushes, carefully arranged and designed, and it bled into the landscape. And I discovered that one of the principles of Japanese gardens was to borrow the landscape, and so it actually looked much, much bigger than it was. So even though he was on the outskirts of the city of Kyoto, he actually looked as if he had the most huge landscape at the back of his house. Many years later, researching this garden, I realized that, in fact, this was one of the most famous gardens in Japan, although not open to the public. designed by a very famous Japanese garden landscaper, designer, in 1920. A man called Ogawa Jihei, and he had a very distinctive style and was part of creating such beautiful Japanese gardens as we know today. Well, all these wonderful experiences in Japan and elsewhere really cemented in me the idea I want to have a garden where I can relax, reflect and meditate and be part of nature. And so over the last 24 years we've been developing this wonderful 4-acre plot in Derbyshire, and it's become Cascades Gardens for meditation and spiritual well-being. It's a beautiful spot, very peaceful. If you'd like to know more about Cascades Gardens, we do have a website, cascadesgardens.com, and I have a blog, gardenforwellbeing.com. Check us out. Come and see us in the summer.